There is a powerful moment in life that many people underestimate. It's the moment when you decide to stop explaining, stop chasing, and stop trying to convince someone to see your value. Not because you stopped caring, but because you finally started respecting yourself. And when you do that with someone who has avoidant tendencies, something fascinating begins to happen. You see, avoidants are often used to a certain pattern. They pull away and someone moves closer. They create distance and someone tries harder. They become silent and someone rushes in with messages, apologies, questions, and emotional energy trying to repair the space. That pattern becomes predictable. But the moment you stay silent longer than they expected, the pattern breaks. And when the pattern breaks, their mind has to wake up. Because suddenly, the person who always reached out isn't reaching out anymore. The person who always tried to fix things isn't fixing anything. The person who always filled the silence has left the silence exactly where it is. And that silence becomes loud. At first, they may tell themselves a story. They may say, they're probably just busy, or they'll text eventually, because the old script tells them you always come back. But as the days pass, something uncomfortable begins to surface. Curiosity. Avoidants often keep emotional distance because closeness feels overwhelming. But when someone stops chasing them, the emotional safety they relied on starts to shift. They suddenly don't know where they stand, and the human mind hates uncertainty. So they begin to think, why haven't they reached out? Did I push them too far? Did they finally move on? And this is where something deeper begins to happen. Because when you are always present, they never have to feel your absence. But when you truly step back, when you honor your own boundaries, they finally experience the space you once felt. Your silence becomes a mirror that reflects their behavior back to them. For the first time, they may sit with the emotional consequences of distance. The comfort of knowing you were always there begins to disappear. And with that disappearance comes realization. Not always immediately, not always dramatically, but internally. Because people often recognize value when they experience the loss of access. And silence creates that loss of access. Now here's the important truth most people misunderstand. Silence is not a game. It is not manipulation. It is not about punishing someone. True silence comes from dignity. It comes from the moment you realize that your energy is sacred, that your time is valuable, that your heart deserves reciprocity, not constant pursuit. And when your silence is rooted in self-respect rather than strategy, it carries a different kind of power. It becomes calm, grounded, unshaken. You are not trying to prove something. You are simply choosing peace over chaos. And that choice changes the entire dynamic, because avoidants are used to emotional pressure. They are used to intensity. They are used to people trying to pull them closer when they step away. But quiet confidence, that's unfamiliar. When someone stops chasing and simply continues living their life, growing, healing, and moving forward with grace, it creates a powerful psychological shift. Suddenly, the avoidant can no longer define the rhythm of the connection. And when they lose control of the rhythm, awareness begins. Some avoidants will reach out. Some will begin reflecting on what they lost. Some will slowly realize that the person they took for granted had more strength than they imagined. And some may never come back, but here is the deeper wisdom. Your silence was never about making them return. Your silence was about returning to yourself, returning to your self-worth, returning to your self-worth, returning to the truth that love should never require you to abandon your dignity. When you stop overgiving to someone who cannot meet you halfway, you are not losing power. You are reclaiming it. And ironically, that is the moment people often begin to see your true value. Because strength is not always loud. Sometimes strength is the quiet decision to walk away from emotional imbalance. Sometimes strength is the calm ability to let someone feel the consequences of their distance. And sometimes the most powerful message you can send is no message at all. Because silence, when it comes from self-respect, carries a message words could never fully express. It says, I value myself. I refuse to chase what refuses to choose me. And I am strong enough to move forward whether you return or not. Avoidants often move through relationships with an unconscious desire to maintain emotional control. Not control in a manipulative sense, but control in the sense of keeping their inner world protected. For many avoidant individuals, closeness can feel overwhelming. Deep emotional connection can trigger fears of losing independence, fears of vulnerability, or fears of being consumed by someone else's needs. So over time, they develop a pattern that helps them regulate these feelings. They create space, they withdraw, and very often the other person moves toward them to close that gap. This dynamic becomes predictable. When they step back, someone else usually steps forward. When they become quiet, the other person sends messages, asks questions, tries to reconnect, or attempts to repair the emotional distance. That reaction reassures the avoidant person in a subtle way. It reinforces the belief that even if they pull away, the connection will remain available. They may not consciously think this, but the pattern gives them a sense of emotional safety. Because of that, they begin to expect the chase. They expect that the silence they create will eventually be filled by someone else's effort. And when that happens repeatedly, the dynamic starts to feel normal. They maintain the emotional distance they are comfortable with, while the other person works harder to close the space between them. But something powerful happens when that pattern suddenly stops. When you remain silent longer than they expected, you interrupt the rhythm they have become used to. The predictable script they rely on no longer plays out the same way. Instead of the usual reassurance that someone is still reaching for them, they are met with stillness. At first, the avoidant person may not immediately notice the shift. They might assume that you are simply busy or taking time for yourself. After all, in their experience, people who care tend to return quickly. But as the silence stretches beyond what they anticipated, something begins to change inside their mind. The absence of your reaction removes the sense of control they unconsciously relied on. Control in relationships often comes from predictability. When someone knows exactly how the other person will respond, they feel emotionally stable within that pattern. But when the expected response disappears, uncertainty replaces that stability. And uncertainty can be deeply unsettling. Suddenly, the avoidant person begins to question things they normally don't question. They may start wondering why the usual response hasn't happened. They may check their phone more often. They may replay previous conversations in their mind, trying to understand whether something shifted that they didn't notice before. This is where curiosity begins to take root. Curiosity is powerful because it opens a door that avoidance normally keeps closed. Avoidants often move away from emotional reflection because reflection brings them closer to feelings they prefer to keep at a distance. But when the dynamic changes unexpectedly, the mind naturally tries to make sense of it. And without realizing it, they begin thinking about you more. They think about the last interaction you had. They think about how you usually respond. They compare the present silence to the past patterns they were accustomed to. And the longer that silence remains, the louder it becomes. Your absence disrupts their emotional autopilot. For the first time in a while, they are not reacting to your pursuit. Instead, they are reacting to your absence, and that shift places them in a position they rarely experience, the position of wondering where you stand. This is significant because avoidants often maintain emotional distance by assuming the connect. Tension is still there, waiting for them, but when the usual reassurance disappears, they can no longer rely on that assumption with the same confidence. The silence introduces a new emotional reality. And in that reality, they are no longer completely certain that the connection remains exactly where they left it. In many relationship dynamics, especially with someone who tends to avoid emotional closeness, there is often an unspoken expectation that the other person will keep the connection alive. When tension appears or distance is created, the avoidant individual may step back, sometimes unconsciously expecting the other person to bridge the gap. Over time, this forms a pattern. They withdraw and someone else pursues. They become distant and someone else tries to reconnect. This cycle can continue for months or even years without either person fully realizing how predictable it has become. The pursuit becomes familiar. The chase becomes part of the emotional rhythm of the relationship. But something remarkable happens when that expected chase disappears. When you stop filling the silence with messages, explanations, or emotional reassurance, you interrupt the pattern they have grown used to. And the moment that pattern breaks, the mind naturally searches for answers. Human beings are wired to understand shifts in behavior, especially when those shifts involve someone who once played a consistent role in their life. For the avoidant individual, the sudden absence of pursuit creates a psychological gap they did not anticipate. At first, they may assume the silence is temporary. They might believe you are simply giving space or waiting for the right moment to reconnect. In their experience, people who cared before usually return. But when the silence continues longer than expected, curiosity begins to replace certainty. Curiosity is powerful because it activates attention. Instead of focusing on maintaining distance, the avoidant person starts paying closer attention to what is happening. They might check their phone more often, wondering if you have reached out yet. They might think about your last conversation, trying to remember if something significant happened that caused the shift. Small details that once seemed unimportant suddenly begin to matter. And this is the moment where reflection quietly begins. Reflection is something avoidants often sidestep because it brings them closer to emotions they prefer to keep contained. But curiosity opens the door to reflection, without them realizing it. When the usual pattern is broken, their mind naturally begins reviewing the relationship from a new perspective. They may start asking questions they never asked before. Why hasn't this person reached out? Did I push them too far? Were they more important to me than I realized? These questions may not come all at once, and they may not appear in a dramatic moment of realization. Instead, they often arrive in small, quiet thoughts that surface throughout the day, a memory of a conversation, a reminder of a shared moment, a sudden awareness that the familiar presence they once had access to is no longer there in the same way. Curiosity gradually shifts into awareness. The avoidant individual begins to notice the emotional space you once occupied in their life. When someone is constantly present, it is easy to take that presence for granted. The mind becomes accustomed to their availability, assuming they will always be there in the background. But when that presence disappears, the contrast becomes noticeable. Silence highlights what used to be constant. And through that silence, the avoidant person may begin reflecting on their own role in the dynamic. They might recall times when they pulled away or avoided deeper conversations. They might realize that someone else carried more of the emotional effort than they previously acknowledged. This reflection is not always comfortable. Avoidants often protect themselves by minimizing emotional intensity or convincing themselves that distance is necessary. But when the person who once closed the distance stops doing so, the mind has fewer ways to maintain that protective narrative. Instead, the reality of the relationship becomes clearer. Curiosity keeps them thinking. Reflection keeps them examining their own behavior. And the longer the unexpected silence remains, the more space there is for these thoughts to grow. What once felt predictable now feels uncertain. What once felt secure now feels open-ended. And in that open space, the avoidant person begins to engage with feelings and questions they may have avoided before. Avoidant individuals often develop a habit of stepping away from emotional intensity. This doesn't necessarily mean they don't feel deeply. In fact, many avoidant people experience strong emotions, but they have learned over time that distance feels safer than fully engaging with those emotions. When situations become too emotionally demanding, their instinct is often to withdraw, distract themselves, or create space so they don't have to confront the discomfort directly. In many relationships, this pattern becomes reinforced without either person realizing it. When the avoidant partner pulls away, the other person usually responds by reaching out more, asking questions, trying to resolve the issue, or reassuring them of the connection. While these efforts often come from love and genuine care, they also have an unintended effect. They reduce the amount of emotional responsibility the avoidant person has to face. The moment things feel intense, they step back, and soon after someone else steps forward to fix the distance. This creates a kind of emotional escape route. because the avoidant person never has to sit in the discomfort for very long. The moment tension appears, the other person begins filling the silence with effort, explanations, or emotional energy. As a result, the avoidant individual rarely experiences the full emotional weight of their withdrawal. But when you stay silent longer than they expected, that escape route suddenly disappears. Instead of someone rushing in to repair the connection, there is space. Instead of the usual reassurance that everything will return to normal, there is quiet. And within that quiet, the avoidant person is left alone with something they usually avoid: their own feelings. At first, they may try to distract themselves. They may focus on work, hobbies, or social activities. Avoidants are often skilled at keeping themselves busy so they don't have to examine uncomfortable emotions too closely. But even with distractions, the mind has a way of returning to unresolved situations. Your silence becomes a reminder that something has shifted. Without the familiar messages or attempts to reconnect, the avoidant individual begins to notice the emotional gap more clearly. The space you once filled in their daily life becomes more visible. Moments that used to include communication with you now feel different, and that difference can bring unexpected emotions to the surface. These emotions may include confusion, regret, curiosity, or even sadness. For someone who is used to managing emotions by creating distance, this experience can feel unfamiliar. They may start replaying interactions in their mind, trying to understand what led to the current situation. Conversations that once seemed small may suddenly appear more significant. Words they dismissed before may begin to carry new meaning, and with no one rushing in to smooth things they are forced to sit with those thoughts longer than they normally would. This is where real emotional confrontation begins. Not confrontation in the sense of an argument, but in the sense of facing feelings that were previously pushed aside. The silence removes the external noise that usually distracts them. Without constant communication to regulate the connection, they are left with the internal experience of the relationship. They may start to recognize the emotional impact of their distancing behavior. They may realize that their withdrawal affected someone who cared deeply about them. They may even feel a sense of loss that they had not anticipated. These realizations often come slowly. Avoidants are not typically people who suddenly transform overnight. Their habits of emotional protection developed over time, and those habits don't disappear instantly. But when silence removes the usual escape routes, it creates a space where reflection and feeling can begin. Instead of immediately running from discomfort, they are confronted with it. And in that confrontation, emotions they once avoided start to surface in ways they can no longer completely ignore. In many relationships, especially with someone who tends to withdraw emotionally, the person who cares deeply often continues to show up, regardless of how distant the other person becomes. They send the message, they start the conversation, they try to repair misunderstandings, and they keep the connection alive even when the energy is not fully reciprocated. Over time, this constant presence becomes familiar to the avoidant individual. They may not consciously take it for granted, but the steady availability of that person becomes part of the emotional background of their life. Because of this, the avoidant rarely has to experience what it feels like when that presence truly disappears. The connectee remains accessible. Even if they step away for a while, they know on some level that the other person is still there, still willing to talk, still trying to maintain the bond. This creates a sense of emotional security that exists without them having to actively nurture the relationship. But when you finally step back and allow silence to remain, something changes. For the first time, the avoidant person experiences a real absence where there was once constant effort. The familiar messages stop appearing. The conversations that once filled small moments of the day are no longer there. The emotional energy that used to reach out toward them has quietly withdrawn, and this absence creates space. Space that did not exist before. When someone is always present, the mind does not fully register their importance. Human beings often become accustomed to what is consistently available. It becomes part of the normal rhythm of life, something expected rather than consciously appreciated. But when that presence disappears, the contrast between before and now becomes impossible to ignore. The avoidant person begins to notice the empty spaces your presence once filled. They may notice it during simple moments, when they check their phone and see no message where there used to be one, or when they experience something during their day that they would have once shared with you. These small realizations slowly accumulate, forming a clearer awareness of the role you played in their emotional world. And through this awareness, they begin to feel the weight of what they may have lost. Not always immediately, and not always dramatically. Sometimes it appears as a quiet sense that something is missing. Sometimes it shows up as a thought about you that lingers longer than expected. Other times it may appear as a feeling of regret when they remember how consistently you showed up for them. Your absence becomes a kind of emotional mirror. It reflects back to them the effort, patience, and care that once existed in the connection. When that reflection appears, they are faced with a reality they may not have fully recognized before. The relationship had value, and that value came largely from the presence you brought into it. This realization can be uncomfortable for someone who is used to maintaining emotional distance. Avoidants often protect themselves by minimizing emotional attachment or convincing themselves that they do not need deep connection. But when someone important steps away, the absence challenges that belief. It reveals that the relationship did occupy a meaningful place in their life. They begin to remember the ways you supported them, listened to them, and remained present even during moments when they struggled to give the same level of openness in return. And as those memories surface, the emotional weight grows stronger. They may start wondering if they allowed something valuable to slip away. They may question whether their distance created consequences they did not anticipate. The space created by your absence gives these thoughts room to develop in ways they never could while you were still actively maintaining the connection. Because when someone is always trying to hold the relationship together, the avoidant rarely experiences the full impact of their own withdrawal. But when that effort disappears, the emotional balance shifts. The silence becomes an experience they must face on their own. And within that experience, they begin to feel the true significance of the connection that once existed. In many relationships where one person has avoidant tendencies, an imbalance of emotional effort slowly forms over time. One person becomes the one who reaches out first, initiates conversations, asks how things are going, and tries to resolve misunderstandings. The other person, often without intending harm, becomes accustomed to receiving that effort rather than matching it consistently. The connection begins to operate on a subtle but powerful pattern. One gives more energy to keep the relationship alive, while the other maintains a comfortable distance. At first, the person who gives more may not even notice how much they are investing. They simply care deeply and want the relationship to succeed. So they step forward whenever tension appears. They fill the silence with messages. They offer reassurance when the other person pulls away. Their intentions come from love, patience, and hope that the connection will eventually become balanced. But over time, this pattern quietly shifts the power dynamic in the relationship. Power in relationships is not about control or dominance. It is about emotional positioning. The person who consistently pursues often becomes the one who feels the greatest fear of losing the connection. They worry about saying the wrong thing, creating distance, about whether the other person will pull away again. Their attention becomes centered on maintaining the bond. Meanwhile, the avoidant partner may begin to feel less urgency about maintaining the connection because they sense that the other person will step in whenever distance appears. Without realizing it, the avoidant individual begins to hold more emotional leverage. Not because they are intentionally manipulating the situation, but because the structure of the dynamic places them in a position where they are less responsible for preserving the relationship. The other person carries most of that responsibility. This is why silence can become such a transformative moment. When you stop overgiving and allow the silence to exist, the entire dynamic begins to shift. The emotional energy that once flowed constantly toward the avoidant person suddenly pauses. The person who used to close every gap no longer does so. The pattern that defined the relationship loses its familiar shape. And with that shift, the balance of power quietly returns. Your silence communicates something important without saying a single word. It shows that your presence in the relationship was never a sign of weakness or desperation. It was a choice to care, to invest, and to nurture the connection. When you withdraw that effort, the avoidant person begins to recognize that the relationship does not sustain itself automatically. They start to realize that your energy was a key part of what kept the bond alive. Without that energy filling the space, they are faced with a different reality. If the connection is going to continue, it may require effort from them as well. The emotional responsibility they once avoided now becomes more visible. This realization can be unsettling. Avoidants often feel most comfortable when relationships require minimal emotion, pressure from them. When someone else carries the weight of communication and reassurance, they can maintain distance while still enjoying the benefits of connection. But when the other person steps back, the safety of that arrangement begins to dissolve. The silence invites a question they may not have considered before. What role am I willing to play in maintaining this relationship? And that question places them in unfamiliar territory. Your quiet withdrawal shows that you are no longer willing to give endlessly without reciprocity. It demonstrates that your time, attention, and emotional energy have value. Instead of chasing validation or closeness, you begin directing that energy back into your own life, your own growth, and your own peace. That shift is powerful because it redefines the relationship dynamic. You are no longer positioned as the person who must prove your worth or fight to keep the connection alive. Instead, you stand in a place of self-respect where your presence becomes something that must be met with equal care. In that space, the avoidant individual begins to see the relationship differently. The power that once came from your constant pursuit fades, and what replaces it is a quiet understanding. Your attention is no longer guaranteed, and your presence must be valued if it is to remain. In many relationships involving an avoidant individual, the patterns of behavior become so familiar that they rarely get questioned. The avoidant partner withdraws when things become emotionally intense, and the other person moves closer to repair the distance. This cycle can repeat itself many times without either person stopping to examine why it keeps happening. It becomes an unconscious rhythm. One person pulls away, the other person pursues, and eventually the connection stabilizes again. For the avoidant individual, this pattern can feel normal. They may believe that stepping back is simply part of how relationships work. When they need space, they take it. When the other person reaches out, the connection resumes. Because the pattern resolves itself repeatedly, there is little pressure for them to analyze their own behavior or consider the emotional impact of their actions. But when you remain silent longer than they expected, that familiar rhythm disappears. Suddenly, the sequence they relied on does not unfold the way it always has. Instead of the other person stepping forward to reconnect, there is stillness. No message arrives to close the gap. No attempt is made to smooth over the distance. The silence remains exactly where it is. This disruption can be surprisingly powerful because it interrupts their emotional autopilot. Human beings often examine their behavior only when something unexpected occurs. As long as life follows predictable patterns, the mind simply moves forward without much reflection. But when the usual outcome changes, the brain naturally begins searching for explanations. For the avoidant person, your silence becomes that unexpected change. At first, they may assume the situation will correct itself the way it always has. They might expect you to reach out eventually, perhaps after a few days, or when emotions have cooled down. But when the silence continues beyond that familiar time frame, uncertainty begins to take hold. And uncertainty leads to questioning. They may start reviewing recent interactions in their mind. Conversations that once seemed ordinary suddenly become important clues. They might recall moments where they pulled away or avoided discussing something meaningful. Small actions that once felt insignificant begin to look different when viewed from the perspective of potential loss. This process is subtle but meaningful, because for the first time, they are not simply reacting to your effort to reconnect. Instead, they are analyzing their own role in the dynamic. They may begin asking themselves whether their tendency to withdraw created consequences they did not anticipate. Did they push the other person too far? Did their distance make the relationship feel one-sided? Was the other person giving more than they realized? These questions are significant because avoidants often protect themselves by minimizing emotional complexity. By keeping relationships at a comfortable distance, they avoid the need to confront deeper emotional responsibilities. But when the usual pattern breaks, that protective strategy becomes harder to maintain. Your silence removes the distraction of constant interaction. Without new conversations filling the space, their mind has room to wander back to the unresolved situation. Thoughts about the relationship may appear unexpectedly during quiet moments, while driving, working, or lying awake at night. These moments of reflection can gradually deepen their awareness of the dynamic that existed between you. And as awareness grows, self-questioning becomes more natural. They may begin to wonder if their instinct to withdraw has affected more relationships than they previously acknowledged. They might notice similarities between past situations and the current one. This recognition can be uncomfortable, but it also opens the door to greater understanding. Not every avoidant person will immediately change their behavior because of this reflection. Patterns that develop over many years rarely disappear overnight. However, the disruption of the familiar dynamic plants a seed of awareness. For perhaps the first time in the relationship, they are not simply reacting to someone else's pursuit. Instead, they are quietly examining the role their own actions may have played in shaping the outcome. In many emotionally imbalanced relationships, people believe that the way to be heard is to speak louder, explain more, and fight harder to make someone understand their feelings. When someone pulls away, the instinct is often to send another message, to clarify intentions, to express pain, or to try once again to make the other person see what the relationship means. Words become the primary tool people use to defend their value and keep the connection alive. But there is a deeper form of communication that does not rely on words at all. That form of communication is behavior. When someone continues explaining themselves to a person who repeatedly creates distance, the explanations may temporarily ease the tension, but they rarely change the underlying dynamic. The avoidant person may hear the words, but because the pattern remains the same, withdrawal followed by pursuit, the emotional message never truly shifts. The relationship continues to revolve around one person trying to maintain closeness while the other remains comfortable with distance. This is why quiet strength can carry a message that arguments and explanations cannot. When you choose silence after repeatedly offering your effort, it signals a change in how you value yourself. It shows that your willingness to communicate was never a sign that you were desperate for attention. Instead, it was a reflection of your sincerity and your openness to building something meaningful. When that openness is met with consistent avoidance, stepping back becomes a way of honoring your own emotional boundaries. Your silence says something very clear, even though no words are spoken. It says that your time matters. It says that your emotional energy is not limitless. And most importantly, it says that you are no longer willing to chase someone who is not equally invested in meeting you where you stand. Avoidant individu. Owls are often familiar with emotional intensity. Arguments, repeated conversations, or persistent attempts to reconnect. These situations can reinforce their instinct to step away because the pressure feels overwhelming. When someone keeps pushing for answers or reassurance, the avoidant partner may feel more justified in maintaining distance as a way to protect their independence. But quiet self-respect creates a completely different atmosphere. Instead of emotional pressure, there is calm. Instead of repeated explanations, there is stillness. And that stillness carries a powerful message because it removes the drama that often surrounds relationship conflicts. When someone who once showed consistent care suddenly becomes peacefully distant, it invites attention. The avoidant person may notice that the emotional tone has changed. The urgency that once defined the relationship is gone. The effort that once flowed toward them has quietly withdrawn, and this shift can be more impactful than any argument because it shows a clear boundary being established. Your silence demonstrates that your self-worth does not depend on convincing someone to value you. It reflects an inner stability that cannot be shaken by another person's avoidance. You are no longer reacting impulsively to their distance. Instead, you are responding with calm awareness, choosing to invest your energy where it will be respected and reciprocated. This kind of response communicates maturity and emotional strength. It shows that you understand something many people struggle to accept, that love and respect must flow in both directions. When that balance disappears, continuing to push for connection often diminishes your sense of dignity. By stepping back, you restore that dignity without hostility or resentment. The avoidant person may or may not immediately understand the depth of this message, but over time, the contrast between your previous effort and your current silence becomes noticeable. And in that contrast, your self-respect becomes impossible to ignore. Thank you for sharing this time with me and allowing these words to be part of your journey. Take care of your heart, keep choosing your worth, and until next time, goodbye and stay strong.